Weddings are strange things. They're supposed to be about joy, celebration, new beginnings. But sometimes, they become the stage for everything a family has been trying not to say. That's what happened at my sister Talitha's wedding. And I'll never forget the moment it all came undone. The ceremony took place on a sprawling vineyard in the hills outside Mendocino. Rows of grapevines framed the aisle, and wildflowers swayed gently in the breeze. It was the kind of wedding people post about for months. The lighting was soft, the air was sweet, and everything looked perfect. But I wasn't at ease. I couldn't be. I'm Talitha's older brother, Bram. I've always looked out for her, not just because I'm her sibling, but because I saw her spirit dimmed by years of choosing people who didn't deserve her light. Talitha's first marriage ended in heartbreak when her college sweetheart, Cameron, turned cold and controlling. Her second marriage fell apart without explanation. Her husband, Jules, simply left one morning and never came back. No note. No call. Just a void. So this third wedding was more than a celebration, it was a kind of quiet battle. Talitha wanted to prove that hope wasn't foolish. That love, even after devastation, was still worth chasing. Everest, her groom, seemed like the kind of man who could finally offer her peace. He was sharp-dressed, well-spoken, the kind of guy who made eye contact just long enough to seem sincere. I never completely warmed to him. There was something about his confidence that felt manicured. Like he had rehearsed every smile. But Talitha was radiant. She wore a pearl-toned gown that caught the late afternoon sun, her dark curls pinned back in a loose twist. She looked like a woman walking toward her future, not away from her past. And I stood there that day believing, or at least trying to believe, that maybe this time would be different. The ceremony was beautiful. They exchanged vows beneath a wooden arbor draped with vines and fabric. Guests clapped. My mother wiped away tears. My father, quiet as always, offered a solemn nod. It should have ended there. It should have been a beautiful memory. But then came the reception. That's when the story changed. Dinner had just ended, and guests were mingling under strings of soft white lights. The vineyard, now bathed in golden dusk, felt like a painting. Talitha and Everest sat at the sweetheart table, holding hands and whispering to each other. Their plates were barely touched, but their faces glowed. That was the moment Dolores stood up. Everest's mother. A woman with ironed hair, a glacier smile, and a voice like velvet covering steel. She took the microphone. Everyone quieted down. I just want to thank everyone for being here today, she began. It means the world to Everest and, well, to all of us. Weddings are about hope. About believing in love, even when it hasn't always worked out. People smiled politely. I shifted in my seat. She continued, it takes courage to walk down that aisle more than once. And Talitha, well, you've certainly done that. Third time's the charm, right? A few chuckles. Nervous ones. But don't worry, she said, with a smile that turned cruel at the edges. She won't last. She's been divorced twice already. She knows how to handle it. You could hear the silence hit the ground. Talitha froze mid-laugh. It was like her lungs forgot how to breathe. She looked at Everest. He didn't object. He didn't defend her. He just sipped his wine, that polished grin still plastered on his face. And I felt rage. My hands curled into fists beneath the table. I was halfway to standing, ready to say something, anything, when someone else beat me to it. From the back of the room, a woman stood. She wore a slate blue dress that clashed with the event's soft cream and blush palette. Her hair was tucked behind her ears. She looked calm. In control. Like someone who hadn't planned to speak but had decided silence was no longer acceptable. She raised her phone high and said, actually, I'm Everest's first wife. And you all need to see this. The gasp that followed was not dramatic, it was primal. The kind of sound people make when the ground shifts under their feet. Talitha turned slowly, her face drained of color. Everest stopped smiling. I'm Vera, the woman said, her voice shaking just enough to be real. And this, she lifted her phone, is our marriage certificate. He never filed for divorce. There it was. The unraveling. Everest blinked. Vera, not now. You told me you were going to tell her, she said, stepping forward. You told me this marriage meant something. That you needed it. That she was your redemption. The room had fallen still. Even the cicadas outside seemed to pause. Talitha looked back at Everest. You're married? He said nothing. You let me walk down that aisle, she said, voice thin, trembling, believing I was your future. I stood and moved toward her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. She didn't move. Didn't cry. She stared straight ahead, as if the moment hadn't quite landed yet. My father stood too, his eyes locked on Everest. Dolores, for once, was speechless. Vera held up the phone again. I have the documents. I have emails. I begged him to come clean. Then she said the words that will never leave me, he doesn't want love. He wants a version of himself that doesn't exist. And in that moment, every smile Everest had ever given seemed hollow. Talitha didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She simply reached up, removed the comb that held her veil, and placed it on the table. Then, quietly, she said, I need to go. I nodded. We're leaving. We left the tent quietly, with the eyes of nearly 100 guests trailing us. No one said a word. No one tried to stop her. Not even Everest. Not even Dolores, whose earlier smugness had vanished like fog in sunlight. Talitha walked without stumbling, her head high but her eyes distant, as though she were no longer seeing what was in front of her. I followed a step behind, alert for anyone who might approach her, some well-meaning relative trying to soothe things, or worse, Everest himself. But no one dared. They watched like they were witnessing the aftermath of a storm they hadn't seen coming. Vera caught up with us just as we reached the gravel path leading to the parking area. She didn't raise her voice or try to make it about herself. Instead, she extended a small manila envelope. This is everything, she said. Emails, the marriage certificate, texts. I don't want anything from him. But I thought she deserved to know the whole truth. Talitha took the envelope. She didn't look at it. She held it in both hands like it weighed more than it should. Then she nodded once, slow, dignified. Vera stepped back. No more words were exchanged. We reached the car. I opened the passenger side door, and Talitha slid in without a word. I drove us away from the vineyard, the lights fading in the rearview mirror like a stage after a final performance. The silence in the car was dense, like we were both holding our breath. Eventually, she spoke. It's not the lie, she said. It's that he knew I would have stayed if he had just told the truth. I didn't respond right away. I didn't want to interrupt her reckoning. That's what hurts, she added, her voice barely audible. He let me believe. And I let myself believe. We pulled into a quiet inn, one of those small boutique hotels tucked into the hills with stone paths and oversized flower pots at the entrance. I checked us in while Talitha sat in the car, motionless. When I returned, she hadn't moved. Inside the room, she sat on the edge of the bed in a tank top and leggings. The dress had been carefully laid across the back of a chair, like it belonged to someone else now. Her veil was still clutched in one hand. She hadn't even realized she was holding it until I gently took it from her. I sat across from her. She stared ahead, eyes unfocused. I keep thinking about all the signs, she murmured. How he avoided certain questions. How he kept his phone face down. His mother always talked to me like I was temporary. I knew it. I felt it. And I still said yes. You wanted to believe, I said. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. She shook her head. No, Bram. I was so desperate for it to be real that I ignored my own voice. There was nothing I could say to undo what happened. Nothing to make it make sense. I sat with her instead, quiet and present, the way she had always done for me when I was the one unraveling. Later that night, she showered and came out with wet hair, wrapped in a towel. Her skin was flushed from the heat. For the first time since the reception, she looked me in the eyes. "You know what's strange?" she said, voice steadier. "I feel lighter." I smiled gently. "That's not strange at all." We ordered food. It sat untouched. We watched a muted documentary on migration patterns, neither of us really absorbing it. At one point, she opened the envelope Vera had given her. She didn't cry when she saw the contents. Not when she held the marriage certificate. Not even at the photograph of Everest and Vera at a cookout, his arms slung around her waist, a date stamped on the corner that made it clear the photo was recent. "I knew," she said. "In some part of me. I knew." We stayed up late. She talked more than I expected her to. About what it felt like to wear a wedding dress again, to walk towards someone while pretending the fear in her stomach was just nerves. About how the joy she thought she felt was more of a performance. A story she wanted to believe in more than the person himself. The next morning, she called our parents. Mom sobbed. Dad said very little, but his quiet breathing on the line carried more support than any lecture could have. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't need to. That same afternoon, Talitha filed for annulment. There were no legal tangles. Vera had provided everything her lawyer needed. Everest didn't contest it. He didn't reach out. Dolores? She disappeared into silence. Talitha returned every wedding gift. Donated the dress. Took down every photo that had been posted online. She didn't post any explanations. Didn't respond to speculation. And she rested. For the first time in a decade, she allowed herself to exist without the pressure of being someone's partner, someone's savior. She picked up pottery again, something she had abandoned after her first marriage. She said there was comfort in creating something with her hands. Clay didn't lie. It didn't promise permanence. It just asked for presence. She began therapy. Night journaling. Morning walks. She stopped trying to be brave and instead let herself be real. We talked every day. Some calls were filled with silence. Others with laughter. She never pretended to be fine. And I never expected her to be. 6 months later, she came to my place with a bottle of wine and a quiet grin. "I met someone," she said. I braced myself. But then she added, "I'm not starting over. I'm just continuing." When Talitha told me she'd met someone, I didn't feel the knot in my chest I'd felt with Everest, or the quiet dread I'd buried when she was with Jules. I felt still. I listened. His name was Elias. I didn't ask 1,000 questions. I didn't Google him. I didn't give her warnings cloaked in brotherly advice. I just asked her if she felt safe. She said yes, and that was enough. But the most surprising thing? She wasn't rushing. She wasn't diving headfirst into a new story, trying to rewrite the past through someone else's affection. She moved slowly, deliberately. She said no to dinner dates if she didn't feel like talking. She didn't dress to impress. She told Elias about the failed marriages, the vineyard, Vera, everything. And he stayed. He didn't try to fix anything. He didn't tell her she was brave. He didn't call her a survivor like it was a badge she needed to wear. He listened. When she cried, he sat next to her. When she was quiet, he waited. The first time I met him, it was at our parents' house during a casual Sunday dinner. Elias didn't bring wine, he brought tulips for my mom. He asked my dad questions about his backyard greenhouse. He didn't dominate the conversation. He watched Talitha when she spoke, not like she was a porcelain figure, but like she was real. That evening, after everyone left the table, I found her sitting on the back porch. Her legs were tucked under her, her eyes on the sky. I joined her without a word. "I don't feel like I'm in love," she said after a long pause. "I feel like I'm in clarity." Does that make sense? It does, I told her. It made more sense than she probably realized. Love, for her, had always been tied to some kind of rescue, either her saving them, or someone pretending to save her. But clarity? That was new. That was earned. She talked about how she'd finally started to feel whole without anyone. That before Elias, she had reached a place where her life felt full. The silence in her apartment no longer scared her. Her own company didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like truth. That was what made Elias different. She didn't need him. She chose him. Around that time, her therapist helped her write a letter she never intended to send, to Everest. It was never about forgiveness. It was about ownership. About reclaiming what she had abandoned to be with him. She read it to me, one rainy Wednesday afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table, her voice calm but certain. You didn't break me. You broke the illusion I built around you. And for that, I am grateful. Because now I know the difference between a man who loves me and a man who just needs an audience. When she finished reading, she folded the letter and tucked it into her journal. She said she might burn it one day. Or maybe just let it live in the drawer, a reminder that healing isn't always about confrontation, it's about clarity. Talitha also made a habit of returning to the vineyard once a month. Not for pain. Not for nostalgia. But to walk it, in silence, and feel the earth under her shoes. The first time I went with her, I didn't ask why. She simply said, I want to remember that I left. On my own. That's what struck me most about her healing. She didn't just want to forget. She wanted to remember who she became because of it. She didn't edit the past to make it more palatable. She faced it. She welcomed it as the fire that refined her, not the one that destroyed her. Elias never asked to join her on those walks. He never questioned them. And that was exactly why, eventually, she invited him. One evening in early spring, we all met at a local coffee house. Talitha looked different, not lighter, exactly. Not happier in a conventional way. But settled. Grounded. She had finally let go of the part of her that tried to make others comfortable at her own expense. After coffee, she told me something I still think about often. Graham, she said, I used to think love was about finding someone who'd promised to never hurt me. But now I think it's about finding someone who still sees me when I'm hurting, and doesn't disappear. That was the difference. That's why this time felt different. Because it wasn't about hope. It wasn't about fixing. It was about reality, shared and seen. That summer, she brought Elias to a family barbecue. There were no grand speeches. No ring talk. Just lawn chairs, lemonade, and the scent of grilled corn. My mom smiled at Talitha in a way I hadn't seen since her college graduation. My dad actually chuckled at something Elias said about composting. At one point, I found my sister standing alone by the fence, watching the sunset with a quiet expression. You okay? I asked. I'm more than okay, she said. I used to want closure. Now I just want peace. And this feels like peace. I didn't say anything. I just stood with her. Not as her protector. Not as the older brother trying to fix what had gone wrong. But as someone who finally witnessed her choosing herself, not for the sake of proving she could, but because she no longer needed anyone's permission to. Summer was giving way to early autumn when Talitha asked if she could speak at the next local women's gathering. It was a small community event held at the library, a monthly meetup that had grown from coffee chats into a forum for shared stories, often intimate, always honest. She didn't tell me right away what she planned to say. She just said, I need to name it. Not for revenge. For release. I nodded. That was how Talitha moved now. Not to impress, not to defend, just to honor herself. The evening of the event, she wore a simple navy blouse and flat shoes. Her curls were tied loosely, her eyes clear but unflinching. Elias was there, seated quietly near the back, his hands clasped and resting between his knees. I sat closer to the front, not to hover, but because I wanted to see her, not just as her brother, but as someone who admired her more than anyone else in the room. The host introduced her gently. Talitha stepped up to the podium, no papers, no phone in hand. Just her voice. Thank you for letting me share something tonight, she began, steady. This isn't about blame. This isn't about heartbreak. It's about clarity. She paused, letting silence settle into the creases of the room. Last year, I stood at the altar with a man I believed was my future. 10 minutes later, I learned he was still married to someone else. His ex-wife, who wasn't actually his ex, stood up and showed me proof. Right there, in front of everyone. Gasps were audible. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward. I left that night without screaming, without tearing anything down. I didn't beg him to explain. I didn't ask for closure. I chose myself. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't wait for someone to save me or validate my pain. She smiled gently, but there was steel in her voice. I'm not sharing this for sympathy. I'm sharing this because I think too many of us have been told we need to be resilient, when what we really need is to stop justifying mistreatment as something we're strong enough to survive. A woman near the front covered her mouth. Another nodded silently. Talitha continued, I don't feel broken. And that's the most radical part of this story. I didn't crawl out of that situation shattered. I walked away whole because I finally stopped abandoning myself. The room was silent, but the kind of silence that listens. There were no apologies that made it better. No emails that fixed the betrayal. There was only a decision, mine. I didn't stay to explain why I was leaving. I didn't respond to gossip. I planted both feet on solid ground and reminded myself that I didn't need to earn respect by enduring pain. And then she paused, like a heartbeat. If you're here tonight carrying something heavy, something unspoken, let me say this, you are not weak for walking away. You are not foolish for hoping. And you are not broken because someone didn't love you the way they should have. Her voice broke slightly on that last line, but it wasn't from sorrow. It was the weight of truth. She ended with a simple thank you, stepped back, and returned to her seat beside me. Her hands trembled slightly, but her shoulders were squared. I leaned in. You said everything someone out there needed to hear. Talitha didn't cry. She didn't shrink. She sat in stillness, like someone who had finally made peace with her own reflection. After the event, a few women approached her. No one offered pity. They offered presents, handshakes, quiet affirmations, and a few tearful thank yous. One woman in her 50s said, "You just said the thing I've been afraid to admit for 20 years." It struck me then, Talitha had done something powerful. She hadn't just healed. She'd turned her healing into light for someone else. That night, on our drive home, she looked out the window and said, "Do you think Everest heard about it?" I paused. Maybe. But that's not the point, is it? She shook her head, smiling. No. It's not. What mattered wasn't whether he heard her. What mattered was that she no longer needed him to. Weeks later, she received a letter, not from Everest, but from Vera. A handwritten note in soft ink, folded inside a card with no decoration. "I watched you walk away with grace I didn't have the first time he betrayed me," the note said. "I wanted to say thank you, not just for speaking the truth, but for doing it in a way that reminded me I wasn't crazy for expecting more. I hope you keep speaking. I hope you keep choosing yourself." Talitha kept the note in her journal. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The point was never vengeance. It was never about making anyone pay. It was about choosing wholeness over the appearance of happiness. About standing in her own name, her own story, and never letting anyone else define her again. I watched her grow quieter in the best way, less interested in appearances, more focused on substance. She began teaching pottery classes on Saturdays. She took solo weekend trips up the coast. She started a small blog, anonymous, at first, sharing essays on boundaries, dignity, and the quiet strength of walking away. And through it all, Elias stayed. Not as her redemption. Not as her rescuer. Just as a witness who knew she didn't need fixing. This wasn't the climax of her life. It wasn't some triumphant rebound. It was simply the chapter where Talitha became herself, unfiltered. A year after the wedding that never was, Talitha didn't throw a party. She didn't mark the date with bitterness or ceremony. Instead, she spent that day doing something beautifully ordinary. She baked a peach pie. She dropped it off at my house around noon, wrapped in a simple linen cloth. Not everything needs a narrative, she said with a half smile. Sometimes, it's just pie. We sat on the porch, the late summer breeze moving through the trees. There were no mentions of Everest, no references to what could have been. That chapter had closed, not with rage, not with drama, but with peace so still it felt sacred. Her blog had quietly grown a following. Nothing viral, nothing loud. But people read her words. They sent emails about how her writing felt like sitting across from someone who finally understood. She never posted pictures. She never told people who she was. It wasn't about building a brand, it was about speaking without apology. Elias remained. Not in the spotlight. Not holding center stage. Just there, showing up. He brought over books she'd mentioned in passing. Made tea when she couldn't sleep. Fixed the leaky faucet in her kitchen without her asking. One weekend, Talitha invited me to a small gathering at the pottery studio where she now taught. It wasn't a show or an exhibit. Just students, beginners, mostly, sitting at wheels, shaping clay, laughing when things collapsed. The air smelled like earth and soap and something deeper, presence. I watched her from the corner as she guided a young woman's hands over a spinning bowl. Her voice was low, patient. There was a lightness in her posture, the kind that doesn't come from forgetting the past, but from finally no longer being owned by it. Later, as we packed up, I asked her what it felt like, this new rhythm of her life. She thought for a long time before answering. It feels like breathing without flinching. I nodded. That made sense. She told me she'd been invited to speak at a wellness retreat in the fall. Not a motivational speech. Not a survival story. Just a conversation on boundaries, self-trust, and the art of starting over, without shame. She hadn't said yes yet, but I could tell she would. That fall, she and Elias took a short trip to Vermont. They didn't post photos. They didn't announce it. They just went. Hiked. Ate pancakes. Watched the leaves turn. When she came back, she told me it was the first trip she'd taken where she didn't worry about saying the right thing, doing the right thing, or being enough. She said, I just existed. And that was enough. There's a beauty to seeing someone you love come home to themselves. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of return, but the small, slow unpacking of armor. The kind where they stop apologizing for needing rest. Where their laughter isn't edged with fear. Where they love, not with desperation, but with open eyes. I think about the day she walked out of that vineyard. The silence that followed. The weight in her chest. And I compare it to this version of her, hands dusted in clay, voice firm but soft, home filled with quiet music and second-hand books. This was never about Everest. It was never about proving she could bounce back. It was about choosing herself, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. We still talk every day. Not always about big things. Sometimes just about the weather or a book we're both reading. Sometimes she sends me voice notes while she's cooking, and I can hear Elias in the background asking where she left the cinnamon. There's something sacred about this ordinary. She once told me, I thought my story was supposed to end in a wedding. But maybe the most beautiful part was when I took off the dress, stepped away from the music, and started living as myself again. That's the kind of love story I'll always remember, not the one that ends in vows, but the one that begins in truth. And if anyone ever asks me what strength looks like, I'll tell them about my sister, Talitha, who stood in front of a room full of people and chose herself, not for the first time, but for the first time with no intention of ever letting go again.